the topic of human flourishing is one that's really joined to the Christian tradition out of the Western tradition and the tradition of Greek philosophy. Human flourishing was a big thing to the Greeks, particularly Aristotle, and really ethics in Greek philosophy were powerfully influenced. But Aristotle's contribution, especially in the Nicomachean Ethics and a few other works, has been powerfully influential in the tradition, and in some ways, really the Christian tradition too, as a synthesis or unity of Greek philosophy and Christian theology kind of emerged in the early church. For Aristotle, the term that gets used is eudaimonia. For those of you in Greek, you know that eu is kind of the Greek for good, and daimon can be either like from which we get our word demon, can mean like spirit or person, possibly being. So a good spirit, a healthy, complete being. This is not something that was foreign, of course, to the Jewish tradition. In fact, so Christianity comes out of Judaism, which has a really strong notion of something like this, and that's the tradition of shalom. Shalom, which gets translated peace, but really when we say peace, it's not the peace of we're not fighting. It's really a peace, kind of like a full life of health and prosperity, and that's kind of what. So in traditional, Jewish greetings, peace, peace be with you. That's it's what the angels say, right? When Jesus is being born, be at peace. It's not merely don't be afraid, but know that now great life, full life is coming. In the Greek tradition, eudaimonia tends to be a confluence of circumstances that are some of them are out of our control, and others are in our control, at least partially in our control, according to the ethicists and philosophers who buy in to this kind of notion. So for Aristotle, a person who had eudaimonia, goodness, a great life, we say human flourishing. For Aristotle, a person who was flourishing was typically male, a property owner, had health, prosperity, and of course also for Aristotle, very important, had command of the virtues, was a virtuous person. Now the reason for this is that Aristotle noticed something that seems to be true about human flourishing, and that is that there are some things that seem to be out of our control, right? You can't control whether or not you have health, okay? But from Aristotle's view, when he's observing people who appear to have eudaimonia and to have this flourishing, he noticed that good health is part of it. And that if you lose health, it seemed to him that you no longer had access to a truly flourishing existence, truly flourishing life. And so for Aristotle, it was what we think of as differently abled or disabled people were not able to participate, from his view, in something like a flourishing human life. And I mentioned at the beginning maleness. I mean, Aristotle is he very much thinks that only biological males have access to the kind of life that's flourishing. Now that's sexist, but that's kind of what he thought. And part of that would be because laying hold of the virtues. Aristotle had a very rigid notion of what the virtues were, and some of them really very much more, at least in his context, male type of traits or characteristics. If you were to have the virtue of courage, well, typically in the ancient world, courageous people were soldiers, and soldiers were men. And so if you were to have human flourishing, you had to be the kind of person who, on Aristotle's view, balances in between rashness, being rash and making bad decisions, and cowardice, and the mean between those two is courage. But that was typically something that men had. So there's an element to human flourishing that, and Aristotle noticed this, and others followed, that seemed to depend not on what we do or don't do, but on circumstances, the fates, the gods, over which we have very little control. But then there's also those elements of human flourishing that appear to be something that at least we have a hand in. And so when we think about prosperity, like Aristotle's he's going to strongly correlate prosperity with things like hard work and discipline, other types of virtues. So for Aristotle, the human life, the best human life, the robust, full, thriving human life has some elements of chance, but also has some elements of command and control. And that when these are put together in just the right way, we have the ideal for what a human life should look like. Now, shalom, Hebrew shalom is not totally identical with that, but you get a strong sense that when you're looking in the Hebrew scriptures, when we get paradigm, when we get ideal forms of flourishing, Job before everything's taken away, Abraham is he's a paradigm example of a complete or full human life. And you'll notice these people tend to be wealthy. They tend to be able to, and part of that is, Aristotle will say, in order to be a magnanimous person, well, in order to be magnanimous, you have to have stuff to give away, to be generous. Aristotle recognizes that generosity is one of the great things that human beings, it's one of the joys of humanity is to be able to be generous. And that's part of flourishing. And the Bible, the Old Testament, takes this into account. One of the awesome things about Abraham is that he's able to be hospitable to all and sundry. He can bring them in and take care of them, and that's seen as something really valuable, a part of that robust, shalom peace. That's part of a really flourishing human life. So there's a lot of similarities. Now, the Hebrew Bible would probably you probably couldn't get like an Aristotelian ethics out of it. Whatever Aristotle thought of the virtues are probably not going to be the same list of things that the Old Testament would characterize as the most important parts of human life. The Old Testament really values things like holiness and commitment to God, in addition to things like being able to be hospitable, generous. There's a confluence there. So there's some crossover, but I wouldn't say that you could just sort of take a Greek notion of eudaimonia and a Hebrew notion of shalom and just put them together. They're not identical, but they do, I think, have that similarity. It seems like Job loses shalom peace when everything's taken from him. It seems that Abraham's shalom is being damaged when he doesn't have an heir to carry on the family name and tradition. It does seem that they're in both. It seems like there's this, here are things you can control, here are things you can't, but you got to have both in order to have a flourishing human life. Now, interestingly, when we get Paul's letters in the New Testament, we notice that Paul doesn't just say peace to you. He adds grace. So grace and peace be to you. And I think there's an element in that we might take away something where it seems like Paul's perhaps intentionally qualifying a notion of what a robust human life looks like. Because it's not just the life of shalom peace, although it seems like it's that as well, but it's a shalom that is infused with or that derived from grace, and principally the grace of God expressed in the Lord Jesus Christ. And so if you start to think about the notion of a human life that's flourishing, that's full, that's robust, being qualified by the event of Jesus, there's some things that kind of fall out of that. There's some possibilities for what human flourishing looks like that it may not have looked like before. And probably the most important, at the forefront, is the crucifixion, the crucified God. If we take seriously that Jesus is Lord, if we take seriously that in some real way the second person of the Trinity endured the cross, then we have to say that in some ways God's human nature has been ratified, affirmed in God, but not just human nature as such, but suffering human nature in the midst of isolation, alienation, human nature in extremis, in the extremes of human experience. This has somehow been ratified, it's been affirmed, it's even been brought in to something like the experience that God has of life. Divine life, human life have been brought together, and not just human life, but human life as in all of its depths, in all of its abysses. These have been joined to divine life. That might mean, and I think that we get a sense of this in Paul, it might mean that what it is to live a human life that's flourishing might now be wider. It might be able to encompass more of the vicissitudes and the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, to quote from Hamlet. It might have more. It might be. You might be able to say that you're flourishing, even if you don't have some of the elements or attributes that traditionally, that in Greek and in Hebrew thought would have been assumed to be like base level, have to have them. It might be possible to be a person who flourishes without being a person who prospers financially. It might be possible to be a person who flourishes humanly without being the kind of person who has, who seized great health and great life. Maybe the virtues of the person who flourishes in after the event of Christ, maybe the virtues that person must command are different. Maybe courage is not quite as important as things like faith, hope, and love. I don't know. There's a possibility there. Also, Paul, says grace and peace, and one of the major themes of his letters is that human life has become different. Whereas before you were segregated to one particular tribe, one particular nation, the church, Paul has been revealed to Paul by the Spirit and to other early Christians, that the church is like a new race, and it's a new race that is comprised of all and sundry. That's N.T. Wright likes to use that phrase, all and sundry. And it's a great one. It's a great term because it really captures what early Christians believed that the church was. It wasn't just for people who had things figured out. Paul even mentions in 1 Corinthians, in the first chapter, God didn't choose the wise and the strong and the pretty and the powerful for the church. God chose, the things that the world saw as foolish, as rubbish, as silliness, as downtrodden, as lowly. Those are the people and the kinds of people that God chose to make part of this new community. And so there might be a sense that, before, if you wanted to be thought of as flourishing, you had to be deeply embedded into this tribe and amongst these kinds of people. Maybe the church has expanded that. Maybe maybe the event of Christ has changed that notion, that rather than being with just this sort of person, that rather human flourishing can take place in a much more variegated kind of community. That this new race that is the Christ follower, the new people who've been born from God, that these people don't have to look like what traditionally might have been thought of as success or power, flourishing, whatever. That maybe the tapestry of humanity that is joined together by the Spirit in the church is somehow richer, even though it includes, and especially because it includes, what does Paul say? The barbarian, Scythian, slave, or free. Neither male nor female, barbarian, Scythian, slave, or free. I mean, he has a couple of these phrases in the New Testament where he's talking about, he's naming classes that normally could never have been associated with anything like flourishing, and yet somehow they're part of the church, and yet somehow the church is the locus of true shalom peace, this graced shalom peace infused by the grace of the crucified God. That's different. And so you can see really quickly how things might draw out. How Paul might easily say things like, God's strength is perfected in my weakness, right? That you're not bringing what you bring to the church, and what makes the church flourish is not necessarily all of your skills and strengths and powers, but instead sometimes it's your weaknesses and your failures, the places that you're not what you might want to be. And so for those who think that maybe Paul was struggling with his eyesight, like blinded perhaps, or on his way to blindness, you can imagine how what the world thinks of as disability somehow becomes part of the beautiful and good and flourishing community of God, because Paul's weakness is going to be carried by someone else's strength in the Spirit. God's going to perfect it. One of the ways that happens, and this is interesting if you look at some of the Christian ethics, I think specifically of Stanley Hauerwas, he's talked in the past about how what we think of as, or have in the past thought of as things like disability, a weakness. One of the interesting things about that is that the call of the people who can't do it all on their own, they're called to come into the church and let other people in the church bear them up in the power of the Spirit. That part of our Christian discipleship is to be weak, so that others can use their strength to lift us. In my pastoral work, a lot of times some of the people who are getting older in the church, they start to feel like, I can't do the things that I used to be able to do. I can't, when someone's moving, it's hard for me to lift the couch or whatever, and they say, what should I be doing? And one of the things that I have to say to them is, one of the things you need to do for the church is you need to be weak, so that others can minister to you. It's part of their discipleship to take care of you, because that's what we're called. We're called to serve. We're called to be lowly. We're called to lift others up. And that's part of our flourishing. That's part of the best human life. It is part of authentic humanity to do that. That is radically contrary to our current cultural notions of what flourishing is, and really ancient notions of flourishing from which our current notions are derived. There's a great story that Flannery O'Connor, she's a Catholic writer, mid-20th century. She wrote a lot of short stories. She died young, I think at the age of 39, from lupus. And so all of her adult life, and really, her child life too, she was struck by weakness. Lupus is an awful disease, and it ravaged her. She did not have the opportunity to live the same kind of healthy runaround kind of human life that a lot of people do, and that strongly impacted her theological view of the world. She has this great story, Revelation, where the principal character in the story, Mrs. Turpin, she's got it together. Mrs. Turpin, she runs like a plantation or farm of sorts in the antebellum South, probably early mid 20th century South, and she is incredibly judgmental. She just can't stand everyone who doesn't live up to her notions and her standards of what's good, healthy, right, whatever. In some ways, we might think of as first world Western middle class or upper middle class people who can't live up to that standard. She looks down on them. They're failures. And so she has labels for them. I mean, she uses some really inappropriate racial language. She talks about white trash. She just has no time for anybody who's not as perfect as she is, who doesn't flourish the way she does. She works hard. She's earned her way. She's done all these things, and she's a Christian, of course, right? But she's the kind of Christian who looks down on others who, she calls the mentally challenged, and she calls them freaks and lunatics. That's just the way she sees the world, because they're just not normal. They're just not right, and she's the one who's got it figured out. Well, she through a course of events, she has her life shaken up in a couple of crises, and there's this powerful moment at the end of the story where she has a vision. It's sunset, I think, and she's looking out at the sunset, and she's given a vision, presumably by God, about what heaven looks like. And so she sees this procession of humanity, right, all headed up to heaven, and it's almost like a throng or like a marching band. And what blows her mind, what shocks her, is that the leaders of the parade up to heaven are the ones who, by other standards of flourishing, other standards, worldly standards of flourishing, cultural standards of what's valuable, they're the ones leading, right? So when she sees freaks and lunatics, as she calls them in her mind, up at the front, welcomed first by God, she sees people that she thinks of as lazy and wasteful. They're right at the front. She sees people she sees minorities that she has no time for, and they're right at the front. And it's shocking to her is that at the back of this procession are the people who have it together, her and her husband Claude. They're the ones. They just barely get in, right? They're going to get to heaven, sure, but they're not the ones who've seized human life. They're not the ones who've truly flourished. They're not the ones for whom heaven was really made. They're the ones who just kind of get in by the skin of their teeth, because they have an impoverished notion of what community, of what the church is. They don't see how it is that the church is a place where the good life, the flourishing life, is not limited to people who have the health and the prosperity and the right values and da da da. That's not what human flourishing is in the church, because the church is fundamentally founded on grace. It's the place where it's not something that you earn. It's not something that you create out of your own skill, out of your own wisdom. It's something that's given to you. And it's in your weakness that you have a potential for the truly human, authentically human, flourishing life. As we try and develop what exactly it looks like to have a Christian life that flourishes, we then have to take into account the fact that it has to include people who suffer. People who suffer are not excluded from human flourishing according to the New Testament and according to a church that celebrates a crucified God. The good life, in fact, is now possible for anyone. And that might change what we think of as the good life. It might change the standards by which we judge a life to be good or flourishing. And that's good. I think the scriptures command that. And moreover, it has to be the kind of thing that welcomes everyone. The good life can't be the kind of thing where you say you have to achieve this and this and this and this, and then you can have it. That's a much more worldly way of thinking about human flourishing. Rather, human flourishing is something that's conferred by God on anyone, all and sundry. Again, N.T. Wright's language, all and sundry who respond to the gospel. So as you're looking through the readings, and especially I think Creation Humanity chapter 16 this week, be thinking about, if I were to say this is what it is to flourish, to be a human being who's flourishing, who has the good life, right? What would that be, and what are the elements that I would make a part of that, and what would I have to change about what I kind of intuitively think of as the good life in order to account for a good life inaugurated by a crucified God whose Spirit, by grace, brings people into a new community that excludes none, and in which the weaknesses of the individual parts become the strengths of the whole.